The hulking machines of anime have weight, not just in how they move or how they tower above the skyline, but in what they carry: history, regret, anger, hope, and trauma that's buried beneath the steel. When I first got into Gundam, it wasn't the politics or the characters that grabbed me, it was the models. I was 16, messing around with pliers and plastic. But as I kept building, as time passed, and as I started to explore the mecha genre, I began to ask, what am I really holding here? A toy? A robot? Or something with a little more gravity to it? To understand where Gundam comes from, to understand the mecha genre at all, you have to go back, not just to 1979 when Mobile Suit Gundam first aired, but a century earlier, to the Meiji Restoration. Because mecha anime didn't just appear, it came from somewhere, and that somewhere is post-war Japan. In 1868, Japan emerged from 2 centuries of isolation. The Meiji Restoration modernized the country at a breakneck pace, industrializing, militarizing. Samurai were abolished. Railroads, factories, and a national army rose in their place. By the early 20th century, Japan had gone from feudal backwater to imperial power. As Japan modernized, it also adopted the Western imperial mindset, expanding its borders to secure resources and prestige. This led to the annexation of Korea in 1910, the invasion of Manchuria in 1913, and eventually the Pacific War. However, modernization came with a cost. Japan became an empire built on conquest, and that culminated in the events of World War II. By the time the war had ended in 1945, Japan wasn't just defeated, it was shattered. 2 atomic bombs had incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tokyo's firebombing alone killed over 100,000 people, more than Hiroshima. Cities like Osaka and Kobe met similar fates. The emperor renounced his divinity, and the country began its occupation under the United States. And amidst the ashes, something new had to emerge. After the war, a cultural and economic renaissance would sweep through Japan, with new media being pumped out at incredible speeds. In 1952, the manga series known as Astro Boy began publication, created by Osamu Tezuka. This pioneered manga as we know it today, with the expressive, Disney-esque eyes, the Western-style sequential storytelling, and the exaggerated proportions. In 1956, just a decade after the war, Mitsuteru Yokoyama published Tetsujin 28 Go, or Iron Man number 28. This was one of the first true manga within the mecha genre. The premise: a giant robot originally developed by the Imperial Japanese Army to fight the Allies, is left in the hands of a 10-year-old boy named Shotaro Kaneda after the war ends. That setup is quite important. The robot is a weapon of war, but it's no longer controlled by the military. It's inherited by a child. A literal child standing in for a nation that had lost its way and didn't know what to do with the tools it had built. Yokoyama himself lived through the bombing of Kobe. In an interview, he said, "When I was a 5th grader, the war ended and I returned home. The city of Kobe had been totally flattened. People said it was because of the B-29 bombers. As a child, I was astonished by their terrifying, destructive power." That's the image burned into Tetsujin 28, and into so much of early mecha. Similar to films like Godzilla, the idea that machines, especially ones born of war, are terrifying, that they're remnants of an older generation's sins, that the next generation is forced to inherit them and somehow do better. The late 1960s and the 70s saw a shift. In 1972, Go Nagai published Mazinger Z, a landmark work that redefined the genre. Here, the robot wasn't remote controlled. It was piloted from the inside. Koji Kabuto, a teenager, sits in the hover piloter, and the robot becomes an extension of him. It's a fusion of man and machine, body and weapon. That trope, the cockpit inside the head, is still with us today. Mazinger Z kicked off what became known as the Super Robot era. Shows like Getter Robo, UFO Robot Grendizer, and Combattler V followed. These robots weren't seen as just tools of war left behind. They were saviors, gods of steel, golems, built by mad scientists or aliens. They were colorful, invincible, and full of style. They fought evil and protected the people of Earth from outside forces. These super robots reflected the optimism of post-war Japan. The economy was booming. Bullet trains, highways, electronics. Technology had become a symbol of peace and of progress. The trauma of the war was still there, but it was buried under layers of spectacle and power fantasy. In these shows, science wasn't necessarily a curse, it was a miracle. But that illusion didn't last. Then came Mobile Suit Gundam in 1978. On paper, it's still a show about big robots, but it felt distinctly different. Instead of a superpowered hero saving the world, we got Amuro Rei, a civilian teenager, terrified and angry, forced into war. The Gundam wasn't divine. It was a military prototype. It was one of many, a mass-produced tool in a bloody, grinding conflict between Earth and its space colonies. This was the birth of the real robot subgenre, and it didn't pull its punches. Gundam drew from Robert A. Heinlein's novel Starship Troopers, alongside things such as Star Wars and the ongoing conflict of the Cold War. But it also drew from Japan's own past, the militarism that once consumed the nation, the imperialism that had promised glory and only delivered death. Yoshiyuki Tomino, the series creator, said in interviews that he wanted to show the realities of war, the violence, the bureaucracy, the human cost. Tomino poured his anger and frustrations into the script. The Federation, the ostensible good guys, aren't moral paragons. The Zeons, the supposed villains, are born from nationalist resentment, class inequality, and authoritarianism. No one is clean. The series was created by a man who didn't necessarily like the mecha genre, so he changed it and morphed it into something that was all his own. Even the titular Gundam isn't exempt from the series' themes and critique. It's powerful, yes, but it's also terrifying. It can level entire platoons. It's a horrendous, destructive weapon of war, and that's the point. Kunio Okawada's mechanical designs were deliberately industrial. These weren't magical machines. They had functionality to them, weight, structure. You could imagine them in a hangar next to an oil drum or a tank. That realism helped ground the genre in the consequences of its violent nature. The conflict between the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon mirrors real-world Cold War tensions and proxy wars. Zeon, the breakaway space colony seeking independence, echoes nationalist and separatist movements, while the Earth Federation represents a centralized authority struggling to maintain its control. But the show refuses to let us simplify it into heroes and villains. Both sides commit atrocities, suffer devastating losses, and grapple with moral compromises. This was groundbreaking for anime at the time, which tended to feature clearly defined good guys and bad guys, often with indestructible super robots saving the day. Zeon's regime is led by charismatic but ruthless leaders who use propaganda and military force to pursue their goals. The show portrays how such regimes manipulate nationalism and the worship of an emperor figure to justify aggressive expansion and war. This reflects the series' critique of militarism, something Japan had a complicated relationship with following World War II. The series' regimes serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience to ideology and power. One of the most striking things about Gundam is how it shows the brutal realities of war on soldiers and civilians alike. The protagonist isn't a heroic super soldier, but a reluctant teenager thrown into a devastating conflict. Through his eyes, we see fear, doubt, and the heavy psychological toll of fighting for survival. This show unabashedly depicts death, PTSD, and moral ambiguity. This focus on human vulnerability and futility of violence was a stark contrast to the idealized super robots of the 70s. The mech suits of the 80s onwards symbolizes more than just weaponry. They embody the promise and peril of technological progress. On one hand, they represent human ingenuity and the potential for protection and advancement. On the other, they are instruments of destruction, amplifying the scale and devastation of war. This ambivalence toward technology reflects Japan's own post-war experience, rapid modernization coupled with the trauma of atomic destruction. That's why I love Mecha. Not just because the robots look cool, not just because I still build Gunpla and probably will well into my 60s, but because under the metal, there's a story, a history, a question we're still trying to answer. What do we do with the machines and the society we inherit? The ones built by those who came before us, for better or worse. Do we actually have control over them? Or are they merely extensions of our deep-seated human inclination towards war? In every Gundam and every pilot climbing into a cockpit, that question echoes. And that's what makes it so human.